Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. We are glad to have you back for another Texas A&M AgriLife Extension program with the Harris County Master Gardeners Association. Today we'll be joined by Will Isbell, and he is one of our favorite presenters to have do some programming with you. And I think we're talking about integrated pest management, which is great. So I think we have a long program today. I'm going to bring Will right on now. He told me we've got a long one today, right, Will? Go a little longer?
Always.
Always. So we really want you to answer lots of questions or ask lots of questions because we want to answer them. Please post them in the chat, share, like, give us lots of likes. It helps with the program. It lets everybody know that this is a really good program so we can do even more. Let us know where you're watching from. We love to see where we have. Sometimes people outside of Harris County and Houston are watching us, and I think that's fantastic. I think that's pretty much everything that we need to do. We're just going to jump right on in. So ask your questions of Will, and Will, take it away.
Thanks, Brian. And Brian, can you send a test message in the chat on Facebook, just so I can make sure I'm watching the right feed? Perfect. Okay. So welcome, everybody. Like Brian said, we do have a little bit of a long program today. So we always like to know where everybody's joining in from. So please feel free to comment in the comments and let us know that. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and ask them. If I'm going to answer them in the course of the lecture, I may wait to talk about them, but any that aren't going to get answered naturally in the lecture, I'll try and make sure and make a note of and address those. So as we get started, we're going to be talking today about integrated pest management. And, you know, of course, this lecture series is a partnership between Harris County Public Library, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, and the Harris County Master Gardeners. And so we're so thrilled that you're joining us for all of our programming. So typically when we think about pest management, I think we historically have a rather aggressive notion of what that entails, right? So it's grabbing a can of bug spray, going after something, or maybe even in a slightly more extreme situation, we reach for nuclear options. That tends to be how I was brought up. My grandmother taught me how to garden, and she had no problem reaching for the 7 dust. And so as we get started here, essentially integrated pest management, or IPM for short, is essentially a 4-step plan on managing your pest. First is proper planting materials. The second is biological control. The third is environmental and cultural controls. And the fourth is manual and chemical controls. Now, I'm going to say this multiple times this lecture, so bear with me. You'll notice that there's a lot of ways of controlling things. And at the very bottom of that list of ways to control, we have chemical control. So while we tend to have a notion of pest management means chemical-based management of pests, the reality is that integrated pest management utilizes chemicals, absolutely, but they're kind of a last resort. And if you're following IPM protocol, you'll notice that you need to use the chemicals less because you're controlling the pest by other methods. So we're going to go through each of these and talk about them. But I think first it might be helpful to just talk about a couple of terms when it comes to pesticides. So we have broad spectrum and narrow spectrum. You're going to hear me use these terms, all of these terms we're about to cover in the lecture. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page and everybody knows what I'm speaking about. So broad spectrum, these are going to be things like 7 dust or malathion dust. They're going to target a wide number of pests. And that also includes beneficials, right? Narrow spectrum is going to be very selective in what it targets. So for instance, Bacillus thuringiensis is a BT is what we call it for short. And it is a very targeted pesticide. It's from a bacteria. And in fact, there are different strains of the bacteria. And one strain is for caterpillars. And there's another strain that works for the Israeliensis is for gnats and mosquitoes. If I were to feed the Israeliensis strain to a caterpillar, it wouldn't kill the caterpillar. That's how targeted it is. So we really want to, when skewing one way or the other here, obviously we want to go more to the narrow spectrum because it tends to go after the actual organism that we're targeting. Short residual versus long residual. Residual is just how long the active ingredient stays active in the environment. And so things break down, pesticides break down over time. They break down through exposure to heat, sunlight, moisture, soil microbes. And so a short residual is only going to be active for a short period of time. A long residual is going to be active for a much longer period of time, as its name suggests. So an example of a long residual would be something like a systemic, like an imidacloprid is systemic, that can, be in the plant tissue for months. A short residual would be something like a horticultural soap, which is a contact pesticide. So contact pesticides are great because if you don't see the organism and spray it and it doesn't come into contact with it, or if it has, there are contact sprays that have a long residual, but like a horticultural soap, it works by suffocating the insect. So if you don't spray the insect with that soap, an insect walking through the horticultural soap 30 minutes later isn't going to be affected by it. So it has a very, very short residual. Now the next terms get this is a little bit of a loaded topic in the garden world. So we have organic versus synthetic. Organic, we have a tendency to think of, when we think of organic, we have a tendency to think of, oh, everything is, there's rainbows and the birds come out and they start singing for us, right? And then when we think about synthetic pesticides, we think about, oh, it's all polluting, it's all very toxic, it's very harmful for the environment. And the reality is that both substances are designed to kill something. So you don't necessarily want to put either of those substances on your cereal in the morning. Pesticide, as the side indicates, it is to kill something. Organic simply means it's derived from a natural source, and synthetic is a manufactured pesticide. Organics tend to have a shorter residual effect. They tend to break down faster in the environment. Synthetics tend to have a longer residual. Again, it's not always, there are pros and cons to both. I think the important thing is that we get out of this notion that just because something is organic, it must be good, and just because something is synthetic, it must be bad. That's kind of a false dichotomy that we don't want to really perpetuate. So some common active ingredients that you'll see, Bt, Bacillus thuringiensis, is the bacteria, as I mentioned. And Brian, can you post in the comments, can you post the lecture notes? And then we'll post those several times throughout the lecture. So if you look in the comments, Brian's going to make that link, and you can download. I've created kind of an outline of the lecture today, and so you can download that, and it'll have all of this in there. So don't worry too much about having to jot everything down or memorize everything during the lecture. Also, this is all being recorded, so you can go back and you can rewatch it later. So then there are perethrins, perethrums, and perethroids. These are both organic and synthetic. The original perethrums came from a type of marigold, and so they were anorganic, but there are perethroids which had been developed specifically to last longer, because the theory was that if you spray something that lasts longer, you don't have to spray it as often. And again, there are pros and cons to both sides of that. There is essentially no bad, I mean, well, as a homeowner, you cannot buy what I would consider to be a highly toxic pesticide. But of the pesticides that you have access to, there are ways to appropriately use and inappropriately use pesticides. And so that's what we're kind of, the lecture today is really going to be about, is how to appropriately use things. Horticultural soaps, of course, are great. Oils are great. They often have temperature restrictions, so you need to know about that. Spinosad, if you're trying to keep an organic garden, specifically an organic vegetable garden, spinosad is going to be one of the probably active ingredients and pesticides that you're most commonly using. It's a bacterially derived. Then there's systemics that we talked about. These are ingested, but they're uptaken into the plant tissues, and as the insects or the pests feed on the plant, they get exposure to the pesticide through the plant tissue. So when we're looking back at our kind of outline of integrated pest management, if we're down here at the very bottom, you'll see kind of on point 4, item 3, that's the most toxic chemicals. And I should also say that I am adapting IPM. So I'm adapting IPM for the residential homeowner. The reality is that the most toxic chemicals that are used in pest management, as a homeowner, you don't have access to. You can't purchase those. You have to have a pesticide applicator's license to even obtain those. So this is definitely adapted for the homeowner. So the most toxic chemicals that you're going to get are going to be the broad spectrum. They're going to be the systemics. The moderately toxic ones are going to often be botanical because they're going to break down faster. Mild chemicals would include things like BT or horticultural soaps, things that are highly targeted. And then remember, we have manual control there. So if you're looking at the entirety of IPM, the vast majority of it has nothing to do with chemicals. The vast majority of it is cultural and biological controls, and only a small portion of that actually requires chemicals. So if we're breaking this down step by step, we can talk about step 1, which is proper planting materials. You really need to be selecting the correct plant for our area. Now, we have a lot of, A&M has a lot of publications about plants that do well. The Harris County Master Gardener website and Harris County Horticultural websites both have information on them and list about trees that do well here, beneficial plants that do well here. So all of that is available. But if you're selecting a peony, say, it's just, I mean, look, no one loves peonies more than me, but it's just never going to do well here in this climate. It's always going to be stressed. The temperatures are always going to affect it to a great degree. And so it's never going to be the ideal plant to choose. And so if you're selecting varieties that are maybe native or adaptive to Houston and the Gulf Coast region, you're already going to be a step ahead because you're not going to have to deal with stressed plants. And stressed plants tend to attract pests. So when we're thinking about biological control, this is really just giving the beneficial insects a chance to move in. And when we're looking at biocontrol, we can talk about this in terms of the biocontrol triangle. And that starts with preservation, then we move to habitat manipulation, then we move to augmentation. And so preservation is by far the most important in biocontrol. And that's just making sure that you're not killing the natural enemies that are in the garden 24/7 and there to help you. So, you know, if we have some lady beetles out in the garden, we want to make sure that we're not using broad spectrum pesticides because it's going to knock out their populations. And then they're not going to be able to help control aphid populations and the like. So secondary outbreaks, it will also eliminate if you reduce your broad spectrum pesticides. And a secondary outbreak is essentially where if we had, say, on a plant, we had 2 types of pests and a beneficial. And let's say we apply a pesticide to that. It's going to kill pretty much all of the beneficials. It's going to kill most of probably one of the pests, but maybe it's not as effective on the other pest. So now we have now we have no beneficials to help with population control. And we have a secondary pest that is just going to grow in population without any control on it. And so the other way would be, you can see here on the right side of the screen, is another form of secondary outbreak. And in your lecture notes, you're going to see I've actually written out a pretty good description about this, so we won't spend a ton of time on that here. Of all of the slides that we're going to look at in the presentation today, this is by far the most important. And these are the questions. So I made a small list of questions that you should, this is essentially your checklist of go through these questions before you're going to actually use a pesticide and see if you can answer these, right? So first of all, is the damage intolerable? Some damage is okay, right? If a grasshopper lands on a plant and eats a couple of leaves, it's not the end of the world. So maybe we don't need to treat for that, right? Or let's say we have a mockingbird, which is a pest, right? It's a garden pest. Let's say we have a mockingbird that gets a couple of tomatoes. Well, we may not need to try and put up netting if it's just 2 tomatoes that they get a year. And so oftentimes we can think about, is the damage intolerable to, do I need this plant? Let's say I plant, for instance, I used to have this beautiful spread of homestead verbena, which is a fantastic plant, and it was going gangbusters, but it just got so infested with mealybugs one summer that it was almost white. And could I have put down a lot of pesticide and treated that? Absolutely, that would have been an option. It would not have been the smartest option. The easiest option for me was, maybe I just don't need the verbena. And so what I did is I just pulled out all the verbena, and then that solved the problem. So sometimes removing the infested material is the solution. Have you inspected for beneficials? If you haven't been looking, and you should know not only what the adult stages of beneficials look like, but you should know what the eggs and the larval stages look like as well. If you aren't inspecting for those, then it may not be time to treat. This is the big one. ID is the #1 thing in pest management. You cannot treat something, you cannot manage something if you have not identified what you are trying to manage. So, right, the analogy I give here often is, if you went to the doctor and your doctor said, well, something's wrong with you, so I'm going to give you 8 different types of medication, and it'll take care of something in you. You're probably not going to revisit that doctor, right? So we don't want to be that type of gardener. You really want to know what you're trying to manage and treat, and then you can treat it. Have you read the pesticide label at least twice? There are often really subtle restrictions that often can result in more damage or inappropriate application of pesticide. So you really need to read through those labels. Is the product rated for the targeted pest? Just because it's a pesticide, right? Just because I have let's say an insect spray, to use a kind of a lay term, it doesn't mean it's going to kill all insects, right? It means, so on the label, you'll see that it's rated for certain insects. And so if it doesn't specifically say that, it may not be effective, and you may end up doing more damage. Do you know what the pesticide restrictions are? Temperature restrictions, properties that you can spray it on, how close to water you can be. Also, you should have a good idea of what the residual effect is. How long does it stay active in the environment, right? This is particularly important when it comes to mitigating damage to bee populations, right? We obviously don't want to, we ideally don't want to be spraying blooming plants, but if we have to spray near a plant that's blooming, we want to spray when the bees aren't there, and we want to spray something that has a short residual so it wears off before the bees come back and are visiting neighboring plants. So if you answer no to any of these, then you just need to, it's not that you don't need to treat, it's that you're not ready to treat. So you need to kind of figure out those questions, those answers, and then you can start to treat. So increasing your beneficial population is another way of utilizing biocontrol, and we do this through manipulating the habitat, growing a diverse variety of plants. So things like early in the season, have some sweet alyssum, have multiple plants that are blooming early. This helps 2 ways. It helps both culturally, because if you have a pest come in that love a particular plant, they're not going to be all over your yard, because let's say only 10% of your yard consists of that plant. If you had a monoculture and 90% of your yard was that plant, when the pests come in, you're going to have a problem. A, the populations are going to explode, and B, the visual damage is going to be magnified, because it's 90% of what you're looking at is going to have damage on it. The other way that this helps, especially in terms of beneficials, is that it provides a nectar source. Many beneficials will use, you can see this milkweed assassin bug here in the image on a Coreopsis, and you can tell that it is feeding on the nectar there. So a lot of beneficial insects will actually supplement their diet if, say, pest populations aren't large enough to suffice. they'll supplement their diet by feeding on nectar of plants. Sequentially flowering species, this is great because it's offering those beneficial insects things all year round. It's also offering things for butterflies, right? I mean, I think when we talk about beneficial in terms of IPM, we're really probably talking about managing pests, right? But there's a flip side to this too, which is that we're doing that so that we can enjoy something in nature, right? Either a product or a visual. Well, one of the things there are butterflies. So by having sequentially flowering species, you'll be able to notice much more biodiversity in your landscape, including a water source. All of these beneficials need to have some water source. Bees love a good water source, and my favorite is to use a bog filter filled with gravel in the garden. Because it allows for dry spaces on the gravel where the bees can land, and then they can drink in the crevices between the pea gravel without risk of falling into, say, an open water pond, which you'll often maybe go out and see bees floating in it because they weren't able to navigate it. Providing shelter for overwintering beneficials. Don't go out and clean up. You know, after we get that first freeze, don't go out and clean up all that dead twiggy material. All of that undergrowth stuff, that is providing a wintering location, or overwintering location for things like lady beetles and other insects that are going to hang out there, be protected as they kind of hibernate over the winter, and then they can emerge in the spring. So if you clean out all of that, you may be cleaning out their shelter. So we don't want to overwater or over-fertilize the plants. If you overwater the plant, you're going to stress them out. Stressed plants are a beacon for pests. You don't want to over-fertilize your plants because that's going to allow too much nutrients into the plant, which are going to let if you have a pest population on it, it's going to let that population explode. It's gonna, you'll have way too much new growth, and once those populations explode, the beneficials simply won't be able to keep up with their increase in population won't match the explosion of population of the pest insects. So we don't want to over fertilize. We're going to talk in a minute about using good cultural practices, and then also, if every time you go outside, you're spraying. If every time you see an aphid, you spray it with insecticidal soap, then you're probably never going to have lady beetles, because why would they come to your yard? There's nothing for them to eat. And most beneficials not only want enough for them to eat, but they also want enough for the next generation. So they want to, we want to entice them to lay eggs so that we can get these multiple generations a year started in our yards. Utilizing plants that attracts plant-specific pests. This milkweed is a classic example of this. I've never seen milkweed that didn't have aphids on it, but it's a type of aphid that isn't a generalist aphid. So it's not going to feed on all the plants in your yard. It's going to pretty much stay on that plant or 1 to 2 others, depending on what you have in your yard. So it's a great way to have pests that aren't going to go to other plants. They're not going to be a problem. It's a contained area, but that is going to be a beacon for things like milkweed assassin bugs, for things like lady beetles. So it's going to get those into your yard, and then once they handle the population there, they'll spread over to other plants. You have this list in your in the lecture notes, so I won't spend too much time on it just for sake of time. But essentially, anything that has a small, where the flower head is made up of a whole bunch of small flowers, or that has a central structure to the flower, similar to, say, a black-eyed Susan or a coreopsis, then those are going to be plants that tend to be good for beneficials. Here that's going to include a lot of especially the winter blooming or the winter herbs here in Houston. But also moving into the summer, the bee balm, let your oregano and your mint and your thyme, let all of that go to bloom, let your rosemary bloom. That's going to be a huge attractant for beneficials to the landscape. And then the last is augmentation. And augmentation is essentially where we're going to purchase insects or organisms that we release in the yard in effort to help contain a problem or fix a problem that's in our yard. This is maybe the least beneficial way of utilizing biocontrol, simply because oftentimes we're looking at studies, and maybe we read a little study and it says, oh, well, if you want to control, say, thrips, then release this. But what we don't read in that study is that, yes, that will work, but it will work if you release it at this rate, and maybe in a summer season, you have to release it 3 or 4 times. Once you start pricing out just the shipping of all of these biocontrol organisms 4 or 5 times over a summer or over 2 seasons, that is going to, the price is going to creep up there. You're going to be spending hundreds of dollars on products. Also, you have to know how to release things, right? If you release them at the wrong time of day, if you release them in the wrong weather, they simply either won't survive or they won't stay on your plant. They won't stay in your location. So, there are some subtleties to this that can make it tricky, but we won't. That's not really the scope of this lecture, so we'll talk about that maybe in a different lecture. So the third item in integrated pest management is environmental and cultural, and this is really a key area where I think people make the most common mistakes. I think people do pretty good with proper planting materials. We make decent selections, if for no other reason than many of us maybe shop at local nurseries, which are buying for a very small region, right? When you go to the larger stores, they're buying for a larger region. Doesn't mean the plant won't do well. It means that there may be plants that don't do well in those locations. But environmental and cultural control, I think this is often an area where gardeners kind of fall short. So knowing that the best defense is a healthy plant, you really want to keep those conditions favorable for the plants and unfavorable for pests. So using row cover can be a great activity, especially you can use row cover in vegetable garden settings as well. It's probably most commonly used in vegetable gardening. And this can be for instance, the squash vine borer here in Houston can be a really big problem. Well, using row cover can actually preclude them from getting to the plant until the plant is well established. And then you pull the row cover off and you have mature plants already blooming, ready to start producing. They're still going to become infested with the vine borer, but they'll already be producing, and that's much better than the vine borer hitting a plant that's maybe a seedling that's only a couple of inches tall, and the damage is going to be exponentially greater on that plant. So also remember, please don't hesitate to ask questions in the comment section. We would love, if you are enjoying the lecture and you like this lecture series, we would love to know what other lectures you'd like to hear from us. We're actually in the process of coming up with next year's schedule. So if you have suggestions for that, please put those in the comment section. And also feel free to like and share us. So preparing the soil, this is kind of a fundamental of gardening, right? If you have bad soil or soil that doesn't match the type of plant that you're growing there, then it's probably not going to do well, right? If you're trying to grow roses in sand or ferns in sand, it's probably not going to end well, right? So giving your soil some preparation, it'll help here in Houston, especially with drainage issues. Part of that is going to be using mulching. Mulching works in 2 ways. It helps eliminate weeds, which can often serve as a vector source for, not a vector source, but a source of attraction for pest insects. It also makes your plants healthier because it cuts down on the amount of competition that they have for a finite area and the nutrients there. Planting times, this is really important, and there is a planting, especially for vegetables, this is incredibly important. We do have at Texas A&M AgriLife, Harris County, in their horticulture, the Harris County Hort page has a planting chart that gives you a list of varieties, and there's another chart that will show you when to plant what. That's super useful. We find often people, in fact, I just had a question last week. Someone was asking me, well, what kind of tomato should I get for this year? And I was like, well, we can talk about tomato varieties, but you should have purchased it in February. It's way too late to be putting tomatoes in now in the Houston area. So we had a question about, is there a soil recipe for making good average soil for veggies and flowers. Yeah, so for veggies, it's going to be a little different, right? Vegetables tend to do best in raised beds here because we have you're very fortunate if you live in the Harris County area and you don't have clay-based soil. So most of us have clay-based soil. It doesn't drain particularly well. So raised beds work great. The old formula for a garden soil is going to be 1/3 good quality compost, 1/3 good quality topsoil, and 1/3 coarse sand. Do not use that really fine play sand. That's great for making like concrete and things. Not great for plant soil. I even tend to up the compost closer to the 40–50%. And then adjust the others. But essentially the compost is going to give you drainage and nutrient, and it's going to offer a lot of oxygenated air. It's going to offer a lot of porosity to your soil. The sand is going to give you great drainage, and the topsoil is going to give you good nutrient holding capacity. So that's kind of why you're striking that balance. And then for ornamental beds, obviously, it depends on the ornamental. I would say, just as a general rule of thumb, if I'm prepping a bed for ornamentals, I'll throw down 4 to 6 inches of a really good quality soil conditioner or a compost, and till that end down to maybe a depth of 12 inches. The reality is most ornamentals, their root system that is really absorbing the nutrients and is going to be in that top 12 inches. They're going to have some anchor roots, maybe lower than that if they're a large plant. So plant spacing is super important, not only in ornamentals, but also in vegetables. So we live in a climate where on a dry day, we're 80% humidity, and and so we don't need any assistance with fungal issues. We have plenty of that to deal with here. So by planting plants too closely together, we cut down on the air circulation around them, and that's going to increase the likelihood of fungal issues or bacterial issues. It's also going to mean that we're not able to get in and inspect the plant, right? If everything is growing, if you need a machete to get into your tomatoes and inspect them and look for pests, then what's going to happen is you're going to have pest populations developing in the center of that canopy. And by the time you see them, it may be 2 or 3 generations later, and there's going to be a substantial problem. And it could have been very easily addressed early on, and now you're going to have an issue trying to control the plants. The other thing to think about in plant spacing is you really want to think about how big is this plant going to be at maturity. So if you are planting an ornamental bed, vegetables, this is true too, but maybe a little less so. But if you're planting an ornamental bed, say, and you walk away from it and you think, I just want to take a picture of that because it looks perfect, like it's nice and full, you have way overplanted that bed, right? So you need to be thinking about, if you get a little 4-inch, for instance, if you have a little 4-inch of a plumbago, let's say, you get a little 4-inch blue plumbago, and you put that in the ground. That thing is going to probably be 3 to 4 feet wide at maturity. So if you're planting those every 12 inches in the forest, it's going to be just way overplanted. So really think about that. This happens a lot in hedges. I see boxwoods planted way too closely, and the problem is that they then get stressed because they're often in a limited soil anyway, and so they don't have enough space to really branch out. Their roots are all intertwined. They're using water at a faster rate often than the water is being put down. So it just creates a lot of issues long term. Good watering practices, as a general rule of thumb, plants do not like to have wet leaves here in Houston. This is especially true of things like tomatoes and cucumbers and anything with a fuzzy leaf. Any of your herbs or plants that have a slight blue tint to them tend to be a more arid loving plant, and so you really want to make sure you're watering from the base of the plant, not from the top of the plant. Crop rotation and cover crops, this is always great. It reduces the amount of soil pathogens that build up at any one time. And sorry, I have a cat chewing an orchid in half now. So it reduces the amount of pests that can build up in the soil. And the other thing is you can use crop rotation. You can use the concept of crop rotation in ornamentals as well. You know, maybe if you plant something in an annual and every year you get a little bit of a pest population, maybe plant something else in that same location the next year. Again, it will help keep those pest populations from building up year after year after year after year. Remember, most pest populations overwinter in the soil here, and they'll come back out in the spring. And so we want the lowest number overwintering as possible. Or when they pop up in the spring, we don't want them to have their favorite food right around. Sanitation, this is big. So get anything that looks diseased or fungally infected or bacterially infected, clip it and remove it, get it out of the garden, bag it, double bag it, never compost those materials because the average homeowner's compost pile is not going to get hot enough to kill those pathogens. So you really want to make sure that you're just disposing of those materials. Also, you can sanitize, you need to sanitize your clippers. This is especially true of roses, and when you're pruning roses, you're pruning fruit trees, in particular citrus. You want to make sure you're using either 10% bleach solution, and then at the end of the day, rinse that off because that residual bleach can be corrosive. Or you can use like a 70% alcohol wipe would work as well. And there's also the notion of acceptable losses, which we talked a little bit about, right? You're not going to get every tomato off the plant, and maybe a couple of your plants don't do great and you have to pull them out of the landscape, and that's okay, right? If you're planting with a lot of biodiversity in your and selection in your yard, you're probably not going to notice if you have to pull out a couple of plants or a couple of types of plants. For those tomato growers, you can brown bag your tomatoes, right? When they're that's a great cultural method of just putting a little bag. We use at Centennial Garden, we use row cover, light row cover that we cut into circles, and we put it in zip and twist tie it around the developing tomatoes. It tends to help keep the birds off of them. Sometimes it helps keep the squirrels off of them. Sometimes the squirrels just think you made them like a sack lunch, and so they're very thankful as they open the little bag and get in there and eat. But you know, squirrels you have a little opposable thumb that makes it tricky to deal with. You do want to be inspecting your plants and inspect them often, right? Under the leaves, that's a classic place for things like whiteflies or spider mites to start their populations. The new growth with scale and mealybugs, they love that tender new growth. And then also look at the nodules where the leaves or the stems join into the main stem or trunk. And then look at surrounding plants, right? If you notice you have mealybugs on one plant, mealybugs are kind of a generalist. They'll feed on pretty much on a lot of different plants. And so if you notice they're on, say, a gardenia, and you have some other plants around the gardenia or other gardenia plants around the infected plant, you need to look at those and inspect those really careful and monitor them, because you may need to start treating those so that the infection doesn't spread, the infestation doesn't spread outward. So when we look at a leaf like this, when I see this in the garden, this is a clear sign of one of two things. Either it's called skeletonization of the leaf, and it's where something has tiny mouth parts and can't get all the way through the veins of the leaf. It's most often, especially on a tomato, it's always a caterpillar, and it's typically a small caterpillar. And it's very rare that you see one small caterpillar. So if we turn that leaf over, you can see there were literally dozens of, and sorry, the picture's not the clearest, but there were dozens of caterpillars on the back of that. So just by picking that one leaf, dropping it into a cup of soapy water, it eliminated a lot of hard work that would have been, and a lot of damage that would have happened had I waited even just a week to address this. They tend to, when they first hatch out, they feed, but then they start to disperse. So by the time they've dispersed, now we have to go find them everywhere. Just by picking that one leaf, we can get kind of 40, 50 in one blow. Also, remember, we're supposed to be inspecting for beneficials. So we can look at the back of this leaf. This was in McGregor Centennial Garden. I'm sorry, not McGregor, McGowan Centennial Garden. And we can see the lady beetle larva. if we look with the red, sorry, not larva, but the eggs there, and then we can see the lady beetle larvae are active. And we can also see that this is either a Schimonus or it could be a crypt beetle larva, both of which are beneficial. They look pretty much indistinguishable. And then the other thing we have on this, we have some aphid mummies where they look like aphids, except they're slightly puffed up and they're brown and dry. And that's from a wasp, a parasitoid wasp that that lays an egg inside the aphid and then it pops out after it pupates. So because we had this much beneficial activity at Centennial, we just decided, you know what? We're not going to treat right now. We're going to give these beneficials a chance to help control this. Now remember, control does not mean eradication. Beneficials are not going to eradicate a problem. They're going to help control the problem into an acceptable range. I often inspect at night. Often that's the only time I have available to inspect the plants. I leave early in the morning, get home late at night. It's actually very effective, especially for caterpillars. So this is just, and the light that's on your cell phone works really well for this. If you turn it on and you kind of shine it towards yourself and you silhouette the leaves, you can see here this caterpillar, right? And so this is kind of me doing that one night, but there's really no excuse for not inspecting. It doesn't matter if you get home late at night, but you can see there, you can do a pretty fast inspection. It's clearly a caterpillar right there. So you just reach down, you give them a little hug, and you can hear that really satisfying little pop. It's very cathartic. When you spend all this time on a plant and then something comes in to try and eat it, and sometimes just getting to knock those out is always handy. So that is a good segue into our fourth section here, which is manual and chemical control. So remember, we're using chemicals as a last resort, and we're going to use them in a hierarchical manner. And so manual control is really our first course of action. So in manual control, that's going to be hand picking. A cup of soapy water is hands down the pesticide I use 90% of the time. It's just a little dish soap in a water. I've actually gone to, so like a solo cup, you just drop them in there. A little dish soap, a little warm water. I've actually gone to the little small glass canning jars. I find it very satisfying at the end of the day to be able to look back and see my harvest, and it makes me feel good about what I've accomplished. Maybe that's a little macabre, but there it is. You can also use, there's the old classic 2-brick method. A shoe works equally well. I also love keeping nets in the garden. And I don't mean like the really nice, expensive, $60 butterfly nets. I mean, go to the dollar store. Oftentimes at some of the box stores, you'll see them at the very front in the children's section, and there'll be these colorful little bamboo handle. There may be about 10 inches in diameter butterfly nets or insect nets. And they're great because they're inexpensive. They're normally maybe $1, maybe $2. You can leave them out in the garden. If you have to go inside to get the nice butterfly net every time, it's not going to be an effective tool to remove pests. But having these out in the garden and ready to go can be a great way to catch leaf-footed bugs, especially in the heat of the day if you're out when they're highly mobile. Also, if you are having an issue with squash vine borer, it's virtually impossible to catch the adult moth, the female moth, without a net. So having these little, and they don't land on the plants for long. So if you see one and the net is 3 steps away, you can grab it and often catch that moth and then squash her or drop her into that cup of soapy water, and that will really help in the season. If you could catch 5 adult moths in a season, that is going to be a tremendous asset to cutting down on the pest population in your yard. Targeted pesticides, we talked about these a little, right? Pheromone traps are a possibility. I don't really use them a lot. They're useful in limited circumstances, I think. Biocontrol agents, which we talked about, those are going to be things like Nosema leucaste, which is a protozoa that's attached to bran that is great for caterpillar problems. Grasshopper issues, but only chronic grasshopper issues where every year you have a big horde of grasshoppers that come in. They're not going to be great for acute grasshopper problems, like they move in, they feed, and they're out, and it's just you never know when they're coming. That's a different, you have to treat that differently. But BT is fantastic. It's a pesticide I use a lot. Like I said, remember that BT, not all BT is equal. There's BT for leaf beetles, there's BT for flies and mosquitoes and gnats, and then there is BT for caterpillars. And so each of those come from different strains. And so make sure, if you're treating for caterpillars with BT, make sure you got the right BT. So we have mild chemicals. These are going to be things like the insecticidal soap, the horticultural soap, neem oil would fit into this category. And then moderately toxic, right? We're stepping up. Remember, we're using that hierarchical manner. So when we go into a moderately toxic, we're going to be talking about things like pyrethrin, spinosad, a lot of botanical based, not all, but a lot of botanical based, and also baits. Baits are going to be instrumental in addressing fire ant issues, which it seems like everybody wants to know about. So there's definitely a section in this lecture to discuss that. And then the most toxic, these are going to be things like broad spectrum, neonicotinoids, which are the systemics, pyrethroids, so the synthetic pyrethrins, organophosphates. Those are going to be things like malathion, diazinon, you can't even get anymore. The carbamates, those are going to be things with like 7-dust. If you go for 7-dust, that's a carbamate. Active ingredient. So those are going to be, again, these are all those broad spectrum ones that we were talking about. So those are going to be the ones that you can have a very successful garden by just never using anything on this list. A very successful garden. Certainly as a residential homeowner, you don't have to ever reach for something on this list, and you can handle that. That doesn't mean you shouldn't. That doesn't mean there's not an appropriate time to use some of these. I actually use systemics, but never outside. I only ever use them on house plants. They can be great for some pest populations if you have a house plant. But also one of the best things for house plants, keep your house very sterile. If you bring in a new plant, put it in isolation, quarantine it in a room for a week at least, and inspect it throughout that week. And as soon as you see signs of something, then you can treat it. I actually preemptively treat, often with an oil or a soap, plants that I bring into my house, just to make sure that if something was kind of hanging out on it at the garden center, it's not now hanging out in my house and going to spread to all my other plants. Remember, there are product restrictions on a lot of these. If you're using a horticultural oil, there's definitely going to be a temperature restriction. We're in Houston. The temperature restriction is normally, depends on the product, but it's normally in the mid 80s, like 85, 80, 84 to 86, somewhere in there. I mean, that can be January in Houston, right? I mean, so you really have to be careful about that. I've had people send me pictures and say, well, I treated it with a horticultural oil, but the insect is still really it's killing my plant. And you get the picture, and the plant is just scorched. Like all of the leaves are brown because they've all been burned, because they sprayed the oil on it when it was out in the full sun in the hot weather, and there was kind of phototoxicity there, and it just scorched all the leaves. And so they ended up causing more damage than the insect did, when there were other ways that they could have approached that. There are also things, when I'm doing my pesticide lecture, kind of the classic example I use is there's a certain pesticide that's a broad spectrum. It is rated for broccoli. It can be used on broccoli plants, but only 60 days before harvest. Well, coincidentally, 60 days is about the time it takes for a transplant of broccoli to turn into broccoli, to be harvestable. So it means, yes, you can technically spray a broccoli plant on the day that you plant it, and then you don't get to spray it again. Well, is that really helpful, right? That same product is rated for beans and legumes, but only once they're dry on the plant. Well, how many times do you have a dried bean that you want to treat for an insect, right? So just because they're rated for something doesn't mean they're rated in a way that is going to make using it applicable and beneficial to your situation. Best book, magazine articles, or chart to ID from good insects. That's a great question. So there is on the, and I'll refer you back a lot to the Harris Horticulture, that Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Harris Hort. That website has beneficial insect publications on it. Also, Harris County Master Gardeners has publications on our website. And you can also just Google, using Google is a great resource. I mean, yes, you can also often get some bad answers, but you can Google beneficial insects of Houston, right? And it will pull them up. Again, really make sure that you're learning not only what the adult looks like, but make sure you're learning what the larval stage looks like. Because, for instance, a lady beetle, the larva looks totally different. And great. So Joanne just posted in the comments, she just posted some gardening resources there. And so you can refer to that list. And there's some great resources on that. Thank you, Joanne. Application restrictions, we just talked about some of them, but the larger point in application restriction is that in Texas, you cannot legally apply pesticide unless you own the property, and that I'm pretty sure that doesn't mean it can't be a business that you own, right? It has to be a residential property that you own. So if you work at a school, if you volunteer at a school, or you volunteer at a nursing home, you really can't apply pesticide on those properties legally. You should be talking to their IPM coordinator, and all of those properties should have one. And you need to go through them on treatment. So just be aware of that. We also need to think about what can we treat and what can't we treat. The first step there is, if you don't have time to research the problem, identify the problem, and to treat it. And by treatment, I mean treat the full course of treatment. So for instance, oftentimes I get questions and I see questions posed online about, oh, well, horticultural soap or oil doesn't really work on mealybugs. So you can't really treat mealybugs with it. It's very effective on those. The thing is, you have to properly apply it, right? You have to drench the plant with it, saturate the little crevices, clean up any dead debris where something can hide, and use a dead leaf as a little umbrella to be shielded from the pesticide. And then you need to treat a second time, 7 to 10 days later, for any newly hatched, and you may need to treat a third time. And normally what people do is they treat that first time and then they stop. Well, the problem's going to come back because they didn't really have the time to treat, or they didn't read the product label and know to treat the second or third time. So if you don't have time to treat, then maybe just getting rid of the plant is the best solution. Can you safely treat the area, right? My rule of thumb is, if you need anything other than a small step ladder, you probably need to call someone to do that. Also, you need to be wearing the proper eyewear and a respirator. If you're spraying up into the air, remember, a lot of that's just going to fall right back on you, so you need to be properly outfitted for that. But know when to contact somebody because something is too large to treat. Inside, I recommend getting those small little hand pump sprayers, right? If you feel like you have carpal tunnel after you've treated your plant, you're using the wrong sprayer to treat the plant. Like, the little trigger things are great for a tiny house plant. But anything, if I'm treating 4 or more plants, I'm always going to put it in my little pump sprayer. It just saves your forearm. Also, if you have acreage, if you have like 30 acres, maybe that's too much for you to treat. If you feel the need to treat something, maybe that's when you need to consult somebody, or just plant things that don't require treatment. Is the site restricted? We've talked about that already. Schools, churches, nursing homes, those are going to be the 3 big places, because the 3 big places that people volunteer that you can misapply pesticides. You want to make sure that you're looking out for bees. And so every pesticide product label should have environmental hazards and bee awareness. There will be a little section of the label that talks about bee toxicity. You want to use the least toxic pesticide. Ideally, you don't want to spray a plant when it's blooming, right? Because that's always going to be a beacon for bees or other beneficials. Be careful too of drift, and drift is where you're spraying a plant here. So typically you don't want to spray anything if it's windy. If you're spraying plant A, but the wind is blowing towards plant B, and plant B is full of bees, then ultimately what you're doing is you're knocking out that bee population over there, because the pesticide is drifting to an unintended plant. Late in the evening is my favorite time to apply. If I have to apply something that might have bees near it or on it, I apply a very short residual pesticide late in the day so that it's pretty much worn off by the morning when the bees are going to come back out and be more active. Systemics do uptake into the pollen and the nectar, and can cause problems with bee populations. So if you're using a systemic pesticide, you need to make sure that it's not still going to be active in the plant's tissues when that plant begins to bloom. So make sure you keep that in mind. So are there any other, before we go into fire ants, any other questions? If there are, type them in the comment section. And again, please feel free to like and share if you're enjoying the lecture. If you have any other comments, we always love feedback at the Master Gardeners and A&M AgriLife. So please give us all the feedback you can. It will help us cater to you when we're selecting future lecturers and programming. So if not, we'll go straight into the Texas two-step system. And Joanne, would you mind if you would just pull up a link for the Texas two-step system and put it in the comment section? That would be fantastic. And I've pretty much outlined it here, and it's outlined in your notes as well if you download those. But the first thing you want to do is you want to bait. And baiting happens best in April. Anytime between mid-April, mid-May is fine. You bait twice a year. I do it mid-April, mid-May, and then I do it a second time in mid-October. And baiting is going to be you putting down a small amount of pesticide, and the forager ants are going to pick it up. They're going to carry it back. Ideally, what we want is, and this is the key, we want them not to eat it. We want them to feed it to the queen, because she's the one that's creating all the new ants. And so if you remember the old 80s pest control ads from TV, kill the queen, kill the colony, right? And so that's very true, and that's what we really want to shoot for. And Joanne just added that Texas two-step method to the comment section, so you can click on that link as well. Now keep in mind, ornamental areas, orchards, and vegetable gardens are three different areas, and you can't treat them the same. Well, you can't necessarily treat them the same. If you see the arrow, you can take what you treat a vegetable garden with and use as a bait in a vegetable garden. You can treat an orchard with that, and you can also treat an ornamental area with that. What you cannot do is move the other direction. You cannot use the chemical you would use in an ornamental area and use that to treat a vegetable garden. So you need to be really careful about that. I put down some common names there. The names change all the time. The active ingredients change a lot, so it's kind of hard to keep up with all of that. So just read the label and make sure and confirm that this information is still accurate. I believe there is, Come and Get It is, I think, I believe there's actually one other bait that just came out on the market, and it may be made by Monterey, but I don't promise that. Spinosad is actually a great pesticide. The problem is it works a little too well, and so it's not always the most effective bait. The problem is that if the forager ant is too far away from the mound, it sometimes kills the forager ant before he can get back to the mound. And we really want him to make it back to the mound with the food to feed the queen. And then you're going to put that down, and then you're going to assess mound activity after 1 to 2 weeks. And if you still have mound activity, then you're going to do mound treatment, and these are going to be in the form of drenches, right? And one thing to know about bait is, and it's very important, is if it's going to rain in the next couple of days, do not put down the bait, because as soon as it rains, it's going to neutralize the bait, and it's not going to be available for the forager ants, and the ants don't forage a lot when the rains are heavy, right? So you really want to make sure you look at the forecast and you know we have 2 rain-free days before you bait. With the mound treatment, I find it almost works better just the opposite. Like a day or 2 after it's rained, I think you get a better penetration in the soil because the soil isn't so dry, especially here with our clay soils. So the mound treatment, again, it must be rated for the area. You're going to use about 2 gallons per mound in the liquid drench, and you normally make this up. I make it up in a 2-gallon container. If you're using spinosad, you can add an 1/8 cup of diatomaceous earth per gallon. So if you're making up 2 gallons, just put in a 1/4 cup of that. Stir that in really well, and then you want to drench the soil. And the key here is soil penetration. So if you're just pouring with your watering can and it's running off, the problem is that if you were to go down a 1/2 inch, the soil's going to be dry there, right? That's not what you want. So what you need to do is you normally treat 1 to 2 feet out from a mound, and you want to put down a little, let it soak in. Put down a little, let it soak in. Then you have to kind of keep that solution stirred. I use like a bamboo stake and stir it in between. Water again, let it soak in. Water again, let it soak in, right? So it may take you a little while to treat that properly. Usually when mound treatments and drenches do not work, it's because they weren't applied properly. That's the most common reason, is because they didn't get good soil penetration. There are also granules that you put down and then you water them in. I find the liquid works really well, and so that's what I use the most. Then I also advocate using a 2-flag method. I have, my memory is like a fine metal sieve. The chunky stuff stays, but most of the things go straight through. And so what the system I've kind of adapted to use is this 2-flag method. So I went and bought a whole bunch of the little red survey or orange surveys flags and the green survey flag. So because I'm a little bit lazy and I don't want to treat, if I find a mound on Monday, I don't want to treat it, and then if I find a mound on Wednesday, you have to treat it again. I like to just treat maybe once a week or something like that. Or once every 2 weeks even. So in the meantime, when we find active mounds, what we'll do is we'll put one of the orange flags in there, and that lets me know there's an active fire ant mound there, or ant mound. Typically, if we're treating fire ants, not natives. And then once I do the drench, I pull the orange flag out, put the green flag in. That lets me know I have a treated mound. Then after a week or 2, we're going to reassess all those treated mounds periodically, and we're just going to kind of knock the soil around them. And if they're still active, we may need to have a second drench. If they're not active any longer, then we can just remove that green flag, and we don't need to mess with that area anymore. So it's just a good way of kind of keeping track. I can't tell you how many times I've said, oh, I'll remember I've treated this area. And what happens is I remember I was supposed to remember which area I treated, but I had no idea. And so we want to make sure we're using our pesticide responsibly. So just keep that in mind. I also want to make sure that everybody knows, and if you download the notes, there's actually a hyperlink at the bottom of the PDF that will take you right to this page. If you go to the Harris County Master Gardener website, we have a new Ask a Master Gardener helpline. And so we used to have a phone room, so we've kind of adapted that system to a helpline. And so if you need to contact us, you can either click on the contact section of the website, or we have the garden answers at the very bottom of that page, or on any of the other pages. I think pretty much all of them have this Ask a Master Gardener off to the side with the I have a question button, that yellow button. If you click on any of those areas, they're going to bring you up to our online form. And here you're going to be able to input all of your information, your question. You can even attach up to 3 images, and we absolutely recommend attaching good images. Be as specific as you can when you're trying to give us information. Talk about, what have you already tried? What have you ruled out? When was the last time you watered? What is your watering practice like? Did you treat with anything? What are the surrounding plants? What if you were sending me an insect picture? What plant was it on? try, if you were like, my shrub isn't doing well, try and take some close-ups, and then try and take a couple that are further back, right? So we have a variety of images to look from, to look at to help diagnose it. And then once you submit that, we attempt to answer everything in 24 to 48 hours. Now, sometimes we get 10, 15 of these inquiries a day. And so sometimes we're not able to meet that timeline. That's always our goal. But we for sure try and get back to everybody within a week. So just make sure you know that to be patient. We appreciate that. This is a volunteer service, or staffed by volunteers. And so I promise you, they're a hardworking bunch. So the Master Gardener Certification Program, we just got a question, will be offered this year, and you can go onto the Master Gardener website, the Harris County Master Gardener website, and you can click on, there should be a section that says how to become a Master Gardener. Maybe if Joanne's still there, she can find that link and actually put it in the comment section. That would be fantastic. But yes, we are going to offer one. It's going to be structured a little different than our normal classes, but we are absolutely offering one, and it'll have some great content in it. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask those right now. Again, share this video. Sharing this helps us reach more people. It's always good to, there are a lot of people in Harris County that don't realize that this is a free service that we offer, that we do this lecture series, and that we have free programming. So by sharing on your Facebook page, it can help increase awareness of our outreach efforts. And there, Joanne has posted that link to how to become a Master Gardener. So while I'm waiting for any other questions to come in, I'll just quickly go through a couple of suggestions. These are gentle suggestions if you're going to send pictures of things to be ID'd. Always take more pictures than you think you're going to need, because usually 75% of what you take is not usable. It's very difficult to ID from, say, this first picture. In this particular instance, we would know what it is because this insect happens to be very noticeable, very recognizable. But in general, it makes it more difficult. These are, by the way, these are all images I've been given with the question of what is this? You know, someone sent me this. I can tell you it's a wasp, probably, and it's in the, you know, it's yellow and black, and outside of that's going to be very difficult to diagnose or to address which species it is through that cloudy plastic bag. Someone did not send me this picture, but they sent me a picture that was identical to this. I just deleted the picture and couldn't find it. And they asked me what they wanted to know, what kind of dragonfly they had. I was like, I have no idea. Like, you know as much as I do, it's a dragonfly. I can't see any color. I can't see scale or size. And so it was pretty much impossible to ID. This is an image I got, right? So send more than one picture, because probably one of the pictures you send is not going to be usable for us. This might be some kind of moth. It might also be a flower. I'm not exactly sure what it was. And then anytime you can give us an indication of scale, like how big something is, feel free to put in an object that is a kind of a common object, like a coin often works well, or a dollar bill works great as a sense of scale. Don't use paper clips or something like that, because we don't know if it's, you know, the teeny tiny paper clip or the big jumbo novelty paper clip. We have no way of knowing. So it's something where the scale doesn't change in its manufacturer. So like a dime is always a dime. If you use a credit card, make sure you take a picture of both the front and the back and send both of those to me. That's always helpful. And pay your limit down right before you take those pictures. That would be fantastic to know. Yeah, I think that's essentially, we talked about that. That's my email, but you also have other, you have the Master Gardener, Ask a Master Gardener now. So someone had asked about print resources, and so I'll just throw these up. These are not in the handout, I don't think. So if you want to do a quick screen grab, you can do that here. These are all fantastic publications. There is actually a new, I need to update this. There is actually a new insect book for Texas that's really fantastic because Bart Dries and Dr. Jackman's book is no longer in print, the first one on here, which is a fantastic publication. It is online, but it's not in print anymore. But the new one, I believe, is I want to say it's David Cates is who did that book, but don't quote me on that. Anyway, so I think we actually, for me, that's pretty record time. So if there are any questions, oh, there it is. Then feel free to ask him in the comment section. If not, thank you for joining us today. Thank you to the library, the Harris County Public Library System, for having us. And if you haven't been to the Herman Park McGovern Centennial Gardens, please come out and visit us there. We'll be in the family garden, which is the vegetable garden, so you can see us there. We also have the Genoa Friendship Garden, and you can go to our website on Facebook and find out when that is open. And what else? Visit us on our website, on our Facebook pages, if you want to kind of keep reminders about what's going on and this programming. The Harris County Master Gardener Facebook is a great place to check out and to follow. A&M AgriLive Harris County Horticulture. Their Facebook page is fantastic. They offer a ton of great videos and information. They also, Harris County Horticulture also has a great YouTube channel, and so you can see a lot of videos and tutorials on planting trees and plants that do well in Houston, looking at trials, and so that's a great place to follow. You'll also get periodic reminders about new programming that's coming up. And outside of that, Brian, if you want to pop back in, I think
yeah,
I'm happy to wait for a couple more questions, but I think we're probably good on my end.
Well, I wanted to go over, so real quick, we've actually been broadcasting some of our videos to YouTube. So today we were also on YouTube Live. You can watch a replay of this video on YouTube or on the Harris County Public Library's Facebook page. And we'll be broadcasting all of our Master Gardeners programs moving forward. In fact, all of our virtual programs will be also on YouTube, so check us out there. You forgot one thing for solving pests. I found that you can't kill a plant if it's made out of plastic, and you also don't get pests if it's made out of plastic. So
you also have me making fun of you when I leave your house if your plant is made out of plastic. So.
But it'll be green. Like it won't be dead. It'll be a really nice looking plastic plant. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We are so happy to have the Harris County Master Gardeners and Will with us doing our program. We'll be back next month. I'm not sure of the topic. I don't know if we actually have it selected yet, but I promise it will be a good one. It will be something relevant to summer. We won't be talking about Christmas trees as we come into June. And thank you all for joining us. So we will see you again in June. Have a great afternoon.
Great. Thank you.